Good morning. This is Omar Mohammed, and this is our 36 minutes on antisemitism. Today, we are honored to welcome a distinguished German historian, Professor Matthias Küntzel. Welcome, Professor.
I'm not a professor, I have to say. Welcome. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm a non-Jewish German social scientist dealing with matters like anti-Semitism since 30 years. And since 9/11, I'm dealing with especially anti-Semitism among Muslim societies. And I wrote some books. The last one is the most important one, of course. This is this book about Nazis and the Middle East. And so this is my special topic because, I can read all this German stuff in the German archives and follow up with how Nazis tried to influence the Middle East during the 30s and the 40s. And I think this is a very important chapter of Middle Eastern history.
In relation to that, Mr. Küntzel, I have been asking the question of what is the definition of anti-Semitism. And I think since we are focused on the Islamic world, probably the proper question would be, what is the definition of the Islamic anti-Semitism?
Yes, this is a very good question. Islamic anti-Semitism is a special feature of anti-Semitism with special effects, and you need special tools to combat it. It's the roots of Islamic anti-Semitism are twofold. The first root is being in the 7th century, the time of Mohammed in Medina, and all these traditional Islamic features of Jews from that time. This is the first root of Islamic anti-Semitism. And the second root is modern European anti-Semitism. And only if both comes together, I would speak of Islamic anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with the position that every Muslim must be anti-Semite. That's, of course, not true. And I also don't think that Islam is an anti-Semitic religion. That's not true, because we find some verses in favor of the Jews in the Quran, for example. But Islamic anti-Semitism is a thing of the 40s and 30s. There wasn't Islamic anti-Semitism before that time, and it's very dangerous because it's a fusion of both most worst pictures of the Jews in Christianity on the one hand and in Islam on the other hand. If you put them together, to fuse them together, then you have Islamic anti-Semitism. And a good example is, of course, the Charter of Hamas.
Speaking of Hamas, and since you mentioned the roots of anti-Semitism, whether the early Islamic roots and probably what shaped the current anti-Semitism in the Islamic world is the period of the Nazis. The question is, how has these roots influenced the surge of anti-Semitism post-Hamas attack?
Well, Hamas attack was just some months ago, so we still are trying to find the correct words for what happened. And it was not only Hamas attack, it was also the attack against Israel afterwards, after the 8th of October. And so in both cases, we have to think of what changed. It's a big global change in the way we have to deal with anti-Semitism. And we have, for the very first time in my life at least, a situation that Israel is really in danger. We can't expect out of the blue that Israel will exist in 30 years, for example. So it's an existential fight against the enemies of the Jews and especially Israel.
Focusing on the roots, if you can take us, especially you mentioned in your book, the most recent one, and I have read that book, and it's a very important testimony and document. How did this start in that period of the rise of the Nazis and the complex relation with the Islamic world? How did it happen?
Well, it started in the year 1937. We know that the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, already tried to get in touch with Nazi Germany in the year 1933. But the Nazis denied cooperation because they said, well, this region is for the Italians and for the Brits, so we don't make them to our task. But then in the year 1937, for the very first time, a petition plan was set up by the British Peel Commission. And this petition plan says, well, we want to establish a little Jewish state, just 17% of the territory of Palestine, and we want to establish a bigger Arab Muslim state in Palestine. And this was the alarm clock for the Nazis in Germany, because they thought if there is a Jewish state, it might be a kind of Jewish Vatican, which we have to prevent with all means. And so they started to educate Muslims in the anti-Semitic direction. And one of the very first documents of Islamic anti-Semitism is a brochure written in Arabic in August 1937 in Cairo, which was translated and published also in German in the year 1938 with the title Jewry and Islam. And so they brought together both elements in this brochure, which was spread by Nazi Germany then during the war overall the Muslim world and translated in many languages. So this was a kind of beginning. And the Nazis, when they tried to convince the Muslims to become really anti-Semitic, they very clearly saw that their racist approach did not convince Muslims, because in the Muslim world there was no racism, there was no Darwinism, there was no social Darwinism. So this kind of thinking was not custom in the Muslim world. So the Nazis had to change their approach, and they discovered Islam. They discovered Islam as a kind of door opener to get to the minds of Muslims in the Middle East. And so they discovered that already Mohammed tried to get rid of the Jews of Medina. Hitler is trying to get rid of the Jews of Germany, and so there are commonalities. And so they pretended to be Muslim and Islam friendly and so on and so forth in order to sell their special European anti-Semitic approach. So this was the beginning in the year 1937, and then in the year 1939 they started with Arabic propaganda, broadcast propaganda in Arabic language. So between April 1939 and April 1945, a special broadcast from Berlin broadcast anti-Jewish material in Arabic language, also in Farsi language, and also in Hindi and Turkish language. And this 6 years barrage of hate changed the Middle East